evening. I am calling the Monday, May 1st, 2023 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Happy May Day, everyone. Summer is coming. Tonight's Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting will be held in person and virtually by using Zoom. As chair, I will be leading the Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting in person or join via online on Zoom. If you experience any audio problems, we suggest you leave the meeting and then rejoin. This usually fixes the issue. Additional instructions on how to participate are posted online at burnsvillemn.gov in the public meeting calendar. As usual, tonight's meeting is available for viewing on BCTV and the city website. If you're unable to participate this evening and would like to submit public testimony, I encourage you to email your comments to city staff or mail your comments directly to City Hall. Now, on to tonight's agenda. Tonight's first item is adoption of the agenda. Do any members of the commission have any changes to the agenda?
No changes.
Any changes? All right, hearing none. Staff, are there any changes tonight?
No changes.
Perfect. Do I have an motion for the adoption of the agenda?
So move.
Second?
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right, we'll pass that one. And now for the approval of the minutes. We are looking at the approval of the minutes for April 17th, 2023 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting. Are there any changes to the minutes, commissioners? Any changes from staff?
Nothing from staff.
All right, do I have an approval for the minutes?
So move.
A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And that motion passes. At this time, are there any members of the public on Zoom who wish to speak? Daryl, is anybody on Zoom?
Oh, sorry.
We usually have a huge following on Zoom,
Yes,
so.
Zoom? No, we appear to have nobody on Zoom.
All right, perfect. And with that, we're gonna have the annual State of the Lakes report on surface water quality. We have Mr. Caleb Ashling here tonight to tell us about our lakes. Welcome, Caleb.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you for having me tonight, commissioners. My name is Caleb Ashling. I'm the Natural Resources Specialist with the City of Burnsville, which means part of my job is working with all the Great Lakes that we have here in town. And my plan for tonight is just to give you an update on what's going on with water quality in our lakes, talk a little bit about some recent or upcoming projects on some of them. And then it was also requested, I believe, from the commission to hear a little bit about fish as they relate to water quality, so I'm going to hit on that a little bit as well. So just a quick review of how water drains through Burnsville. In the bottom left corner here in green is the Credit River watershed. So water in that area drains to the Credit River, which then goes to the Minnesota River. In the central right side in orange is the Vermilion River. That drains to a smaller portion, mostly Lake Alamagnet, to the Vermilion River and then on to the Mississippi. And then the main portion of Burnsville drains to the Minnesota River. And water generally flows from Lac Lavon, if it outlets, then to Keller, through Crystal, where it meets with water from Wood Pond and Twin Lake, onto Early Lake, through Sunset Pond, through Kramer Nature Preserve on the left side of the map here, upper left, and then onto the Minnesota River. And then the whole northeast part of town drains through a series of ponds down to Black Dog Lake and then the Minnesota River as well. So that's just a little bit of an overview of how water flows through our city. And then, of course, it's not draining above ground a lot of the time. It's moving through a lot of stormwater pipes that connect all our ponds and our lakes. So on the left side of the screen here, We have green lines. Those are all the storm pipes that run underground. There's about 185 miles of storm pipes in the city. The little red dots are the actual storm drains or catch basins that you'll see in your neighborhood. Those are all the points where the water drains down into those pipes. And then most of the time it's going to a pond before it gets to a lake. Then from the lakes it's moving through the system as I mentioned. Then on the right side you can just see here that we have a lot of ponds as well as some lakes in town. And I'll be focusing on our 8 kind of priority lakes that we monitor and manage. And then I'll be talking about water quality relative to 2 different types of standards. One is the state water quality standards, and the other I'll talk about separately is the city standards. So the state water quality standards, mostly we're talking about nutrients. For nutrients, we're monitoring for phosphorus, which causes algae blooms, chlorophyll A, which is basically a measure of algae, and then clarity, which is also a measure of algae and potential sediment in the water column. And for the state standards, there's standards for shallow lakes. Most of our lakes are considered shallow here in Burnsville, and also a separate standard for deeper lakes like Crystal Lake. And if a lake if it fails to meet 2 of these standards for nutrients over a 10-year period, then it will be considered impaired by the state. And if that happens, it starts a whole process of figuring out what's going on with the lake, where these nutrients are coming from, and then how you're going to reduce the nutrients to be able to get the lake to meet standards. And here in Burnsville, we have 2 impaired waters. The first is Alamagnet Lake, and the second is Keller Lake. And then we've had 2 water bodies that have been removed from the impaired waters list. Most recently was Crystal Lake, which was removed from the impaired waters list in 2018 because water quality had improved enough to take it off the list. And then back in around 2012, Early Lake was also removed from the impaired waters list. And then the other way we track water quality conditions is relative to the city's water resources master plan. And that plan has water clarity goals as well. Those goals are all at least or mostly more stringent than the state standards. And these conditions, clarity is measured by volunteers. They go out throughout the growing season once every few weeks and take a Secchi disc measurement. That's the thing you see on the right side of the screen here. It's basically a black and white disc that's lowered into the water column. When you can no longer see that disc, you take that measurement, and that's the clarity for that particular reading. You average them all together, and then you get a season-long average for the clarity for that water body. And on the left side of this table, we have our 3-year average for these different water bodies, and on the right side, we have the goal that's laid out in our Water Resources Master Plan. And as you can see, generally we're either above those goals for all these water bodies except Sunset, which is right at the city goal of 1.7. The rest are all above except for Keller Lake. And then I highlighted in red here are 2 impaired waters. We'll look a little closer at conditions for those as well. But Alamagnet Lake is it's just under the goal there at 1.2. Goal is 1.3. Then Keller Lake is above the goal, so I had that swapped. Alamagnet is still slightly below. Keller Lake is currently above the goal for the 3-year average. We need that to go longer for it to be considered good enough to be off the impaired waters list. Then now I'm just going to go through our 8 priority lakes here and talk about the nutrient levels, specifically phosphorus, over the past 20 years or so. So we have a nice collection of data going back quite a ways, which allows us to really track trends over time. So on Lake Alamagnet Lake, which, as I mentioned, is one of our impaired waters, we are we've had 4 good years for phosphorus levels on the lake, which is a good sign. We are still slightly above the state standards. So that orange line there is where we'd want to be below, if we at or below if we're meeting state standards. We're still a bit above that for the phosphorus level, but over the average of the 20 years, it's lower than it's been the past 4 years. So overall, a positive trend, but not quite where we'd want to be getting off the impaired waters list. And that kind of brings me to one of our next topics. There's been a lot of work done in the Alamagnet watershed. The city has met its requirements for nutrient reductions for the Alamagnet watershed, and now that the watershed is in pretty good shape for the amount of phosphorus that's going in, we're starting to look at how you can reduce the phosphorus that's already in the lake and built up over time. So the Vermilion Rivers Watershed Joint Powers Organization, which manages that Vermilion River watershed, they are leading Alamagnet Lake feasibility study this year, and the city of Burnsville and the city of Apple Valley are participating as well. But aluminum sulfate is something that can be applied to water. It binds with phosphorus in the water column, but also precipitates to the sediment. And then if there's phosphorus released from the sediment at a later date, it can also bind with that phosphorus that's released later. So it can provide good control of the internal phosphorus that kind of cycles up and down in lakes. And so this feasibility study is basically looking, or Bar Engineering will be looking at, is it a good option? Is it feasible to achieve the goals that we have in Alamagnet Lake to use alum? And what is that going to cost? What's the best timing to do that? And so that study is expected to be complete by later this summer or early in the fall, and that would position the watershed and the city in a good place to potentially apply for grants, then to later conduct these type of alum treatments if that's what is recommended in the study. And then moving on to Lac La Vanne. Lac La Vanne is the water body with the best water quality in the city. It's an old gravel pit that has an extremely small watershed. Mostly just the park area around the lake, and a little bit of the direct homes drain to there, but it has a much smaller watershed than most of our lakes, which helps the water quality quite a bit. As far as phosphorus, you can see we're we're not even at half the level that would be the state standard, so we're way below the state standard. The clarity is really, really good on Lac La Vanne. It's one of the best clarity lakes in the metro. Then on to Keller Lake. So as I mentioned, Keller Lake is another one of our impaired waters. So looking at phosphorus levels here, you can see that over the last 20 years we've been above the impaired line there, that orange line, most of the time. The last 4 years we've been below that line. Clarity has also been below that line the last 4 years. And part of that's due to some of the big water quality improvement structures that prevent nutrients from getting to the lake. And then one of the big things that changed the level in 2019 there was an alum treatment that was conducted on Keller Lake. So you can see in combination with getting nutrients in control in the watershed and then an alum treatment for internal loads of phosphorus, we've been able to have some good years for water quality there. And we'll see. We don't, things can change, weather conditions are variable, so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but that's a positive sign for what's going on with the lake and where we're headed in the future. Then hitting a little bit on fisheries and also future projects here for Keller Lake. 2021 we did a survey that found, it was a fish survey, and also geared at assessing goldfish that we had heard were in the lake before we did our alum treatment out there. And we found a population of very large goldfish, which can potentially create issues like stirring up sediment and uprooting plants, similar to carp. But that assessment, which we received this last year, determined that the population of goldfish were not at levels which were anticipated to create severe issues enough to warrant their removal. We're finding the goldfish were mostly these very large individuals, but not a lot of smaller ones that would indicate that they were successfully reproducing. So we had pretty good predator control of the goldfish, it would seem. And then that current population that we had in there appears to be centered around a previous winter kill, which happened in 2013, 2014. There were some goldfish collected and they were aged, and they were all about that age. So that last winter kill may have provided a good opportunity for them to escape predation for a while and get to the size they were at, but after that they didn't seem to be successfully reproducing. Then also on Keller Lake, last year we did our second round of native plant reintroductions. Keller Lake does not have good aquatic native plant diversity, which is something we'd like to see in a healthy lake system. We'd like to see, Crystal Lake has maybe 12, 13, 14 different types of plants. Keller Lake has 4, so we'd like to see better aquatic plant diversity. So we've been doing, this is our second round of transplanting 4 different species of native aquatic plants into the lake to try to improve the diversity. And then also in 2023, we did have a winter kill on Keller Lake. So it's pretty common, especially in winters where we have thick ice, deep snow, for there to be low oxygen levels in the lake, and that can result in fish die-offs in the lake. And we know there was at least a partial winter kill on Keller Lake. We're still assessing to see whether it was more than partial. But we're tentatively planning on doing some fish stocking, probably of largemouth bass, to help to try to get predator fish in a good place in Keller Lake to prevent some of those rough fish, like if there's goldfish that survive or bullheads, try to get some predator control on those fish before they get too big. Then on to Crystal Lake. So Crystal Lake has been in good shape for a number of years. As I mentioned, it came off the impaired waters list in 2018, and water quality conditions have remained strong since that time. So you can see we're well below the state phosphorus standards for Crystal Lake, which are even more stringent than some of the other ones because it's a deep lake with more stringent standards. So that's a good sign out at Crystal. One of the projects we worked on out there last year was rerouting some footpaths that were almost on the shoreline near Tayaki Park and the Crystal Boat Launch. We wanted to move those footpaths a little bit farther away from the water so we could prevent some trampling of vegetation and potential shoreline erosion. So we got a grant to work with the Minnesota Youth Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa. And they helped us move that footpath, create a new footpath farther back, replant the areas around the old footpath with native plants, blanket those areas, to get native plants growing in those areas. And then I don't have a picture of the current fencing that's out there, but we installed some fencing that allows some areas for fishing but keeps most of the access off some of those vegetating areas while we let it establish. So hopefully that helps us strengthen the shoreline and prevent erosion in the future in that area. Then on to Twin Lake. So we do monitoring on Twin Lake South. As you can see, phosphorus is below the state standard on Twin Lake. We had a bit of a jump in phosphorus this past year, but again, still below the state standard levels. Twin Lake gets a lot of its water, maybe most of its water, from Crystal Lake. Crystal Lake wasn't draining very much last year because of the drought. So Twin Lake was also pretty low, which may have concentrated phosphorus in the water, increased algae last year. We did have a fish kill in summer of 2021 on Twin Lake, and again, just to try to balance predator fish populations, we did some stocking of largemouth bass in Twin Lake in the fall of last year. And then on to Wood Pond here. Wood Pond is, again, well below the state standard for phosphorus, so conditions are good out there. As another example of alum treatments, you can see a noticeable drop in 2019 there. There was also an alum treatment conducted on Wood Pond in 2019. So we've had pretty good control of the phosphorus and reduction since that 2019 period out there. on to Early Lake. Early Lake again is below state standard, so it's looking good out there. We did have a winter kill, not this winter, but the last winter on Early Lake. Again, it's a shallow lake, and sometimes that does happen in these shallow lake systems. So we did some largemouth bass restocking last fall in Early Lake as well. Then on to Sunset Pond. So Sunset Pond is, in general, on average, below state standard levels. We did bump above those state standard levels a bit in 3 out of the last 10 or so years there. So on average, we're still below state standards, but that's something we'll monitor over time to make sure we're trending in the right direction out there. And then just hitting a little bit on fish impacts on water quality. So I'm not a fisheries biologist, more of a generalist in water quality. So I won't dig super deep into it, but in general, as we're relating fish to water quality, usually we're talking about fish that are stirring up sediments, maybe uprooting vegetation. Common carp are probably the biggest example of a fish that does that. And luckily, we don't have any significant issues with carp in the lakes that we manage. Goldfish are another one that can potentially cause similar issues, but tends to be maybe more of an issue for ponds where there's not a lot of predator fish to control them. Bullheads are another one that can create high populations, especially in winter kill lakes, because they can survive really low oxygen conditions, whereas a lot of the predator fish may die. And they feed low in the water column and can stir up sediments. And even stunted sunfish, where you have a lot of really small sunfish and not enough food for them, can start feeding in the sediments and stirring things up. So that's generally one of our biggest concerns, are some of these fish that can stir up sediments or disturb vegetation, which then allows more phosphorus to come into the water column. And for fisheries, the city does conduct regular fish surveys on Alamagnet and Keller Lake. Those are more of a focus because they are impaired waters, where we're really trying to get them off the impaired waters list. So we do fish surveys about every 3 years on those water bodies. The DNR does fish surveys on Crystal Lake, and then we have done some fish surveys on other water bodies as needed. And then for fish stocking, Wood Pond is stocked by the DNR as a fishing in the neighborhood pond. That's a program that they have to provide fishing opportunities for some species that may not commonly be in those types of water bodies for people that live in those neighborhoods. So they're usually very accessible water bodies, often with the dock. So that's stocked by the DNR. Sunset Pond has been stocked as a fishing in the neighborhood program by the DNR as well, though it's been a few years. And then again, Crystal Lake is stocked by the DNR as well. And then the city will stock generally where there's a water quality concern, like I mentioned, or trying to stabilize the predator fish population, but more as needed. And then I just wanted to mention, fisheries related, that we also have some really cool fish species in the Minnesota River along Burnsville. There's at least 63 species that live in the Minnesota River. I have a picture of some of them here, left to right: freshwater drum, common carp, shovel-nosed sturgeon, channel catfish, white bass, but obviously many, many more fish down there as well. So lots of opportunities to catch all sorts of different things if folks want to go fishing. So that's a really cool fisheries opportunity for people who live in Burnsville too. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
So we share Alamagnet with Apple Valley. Are they contributing to the project?
Yes. Yep. The city has a joint powers agreement with Apple Valley, so we share funding for monitoring the lake, and then each city conducts its own watershed improvement projects. So the city's met our watershed reduction goals. Apple Valley has met a good portion of their goals as well, and they have some upcoming projects as well. So we're active participants with Apple Valley and all things Alamagnet.
Okay. And then goldfish, do they show up because people throw goldfish into the lakes?
Yes. So yeah, they're showing up because they're unwanted pets, basically. So people are putting them in the lake. Some of them may be very small to start, but in the lake environment where there can be a lot of food for them, they can get quite big. People may put them right in the lake. They may put them in ponds, a storm pond, but then that connects to the lake so they can get into the lakes that way as well.
Okay. And have we reduced the amount of water going into the Minnesota River given the flooding there?
Our projects, a lot of our projects, we've put in new storm ponds and other water quality improvement projects have slowed water getting to the river. Maybe it's reduced it some by allowing it to infiltrate. I'm not sure if we've reduced it a ton, but we've definitely reduced the amount of phosphorus and sediment that get to that area as well. And I think a lot of the big flooding in the Minnesota River is also agricultural areas upstream of us that put a lot of water into the river pretty fast.
Question.
Yeah.
Invasive species of weeds and such, is that an issue in our lakes?
Yes.
Like the Asian milfoil and such?
It is, yep. So pretty much all of our water bodies have, I'm trying to make sure this is correct, they all have invasive species. I'm pretty sure they all have Eurasian water milfoil and curly-leaf pondweed, which are kind of the two big ones that are in most water bodies in this area. Some lakes, if they have a pretty healthy native plant community, like Crystal Lake is one example, where we have invasive species, but they have some competition, so they may not be as severe of issues. Other water bodies like Keller Lake, we have more issues with invasive species because there just isn't a lot to compete with them. So the city does some invasive species management as well. We will use harvesting sometimes to remove vegetation, especially where we have healthy native plant communities, so we can do so without impacting the native plants as much. In water bodies where there's less native plants, we've also used herbicide to help control the plants. And then, like in Keller Lake, we've done that, and we're also trying to reintroduce new species of natives to help try to restore the ecosystem so there's a little better balance of native plants versus invasives.
Another question, please. Because I walk it. Black Dog Lake, is that part of, does XL Energy control that?
It's a public water, so the DNR would technically be the regulatory authority for that water body. The shoreline areas, I believe, are owned between the power plant and the wildlife refuge. So the city hasn't done any work on that lake, so I think it would be more the DNR and those shoreline owners to manage that water body.
How deep that is?
I know it's fairly shallow.
Okay.
I'm not sure specifically.
Thank you.
You're not walking it right now, are you?
No, it's kind of flooded right
That's what I
now.
thought.
How have the transplants been successful?
Yeah, so in 2020 was our first year, and we've been monitoring them over time. And so a lot of those ones that first year that we put in have been successful, and we've seen them survive through most of that time period. One negative that we saw last year, which is kind of hard to manage for, was the lake level got so low that some of our transplant plots ended up being dry for a period of the year, which some plants can actually survive that, some may not. But we're a little bit limited because we can only plant them in areas where we can get to the bottom, and we were already kind of a bit above waist height where we were planting. And the lake just got so dry and low last year that some of those dried up. So overall, we have seen success in those plots surviving over time, and we're still kind of tracking what rate that they're going to spread. But some of those really unusual, out of the ordinary conditions can create some challenges.
And then I suppose, are you going back in then this year to replant anything, or do you go back in annually then to replant the ones that may have dried up?
Yeah, so we've done it every other year so far, so we're not planning anything this year. This year we'll continue to monitor, but we are preparing to do it again next year.
Sort of as a follow-up to that, how do you measure success for the transplant? I mean, what's, I guess, a benchmark?
Yeah, so there are not a ton of examples of this type of restoration out there to compare it to. It's relatively new, so we do upland management where we're managing buckthorn, we're restoring savanna, we're planting prairies. That's pretty well established. There's a lot of examples of this being done in other places. There are a number of other organizations doing aquatic plant reintroductions, but there isn't a great long-term database of sort of what success looks like. So for us, I think we're first looking to make sure that when we transplant them, they can survive for several years. So that's kind of priority one. And then we're also tracking now, once they're getting rooted, they're dealing with sort of the transplanting trauma, I guess. Now, do we see them spreading outside of the plots, which we did see a little bit starting last year with some of those older plots. So that's kind of the second priority. They're surviving. Now are they spreading? And then maybe third priority is how quickly are they spreading to kind of fill in the gaps.
So I'm guessing next year you're going to have some good data for us on that, right?
Yeah, I think we'll be getting there. Yeah, it takes time. But we, like I mentioned, it is a newer science, but one of my colleagues was invited to a lake conference to present the city's work in this area. So I think we've been leading for others and providing information for others to learn from with this project.
Nice.
Look forward to seeing that next year.
I know, me too. I'm excited. And then my next two questions kind of go together. So first is, how many years does a lake have to be below that phosphorus level before it's removed? And then when does a lake get put on the list as an impaired body of water?
Yeah, so it's put on the list if two of those parameters, the phosphorus, clarity, and chlorophyll A, if two of those are above that standard line over an average of 10 years, then it's put on. And then it's kind of the opposite to be removed off. We have to have at least two of those parameters be below state standards over an average of 10 years. So it's kind of all about that 10-year period and the average of it.
Okay.
And it can't just be for phosphorus. If we have phosphorus that's below, but chlorophyll A and clarity are still above the state standards, we wouldn't be able to get off the list. You have to have at least two of those parameters that are all kind of tied into that nutrient category be below to get off the list.
So I think it was sunset that was kind of jumping up there, right? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah. And for clarity, it's closer to the city clarity goal. That was not as concerning for the state water clarity goal, but it is getting closer to that, yeah. So it'd have to be over that 10-year average.
Okay. Sounds good. So it's kind of normal to see it jump up and down then, like we're kind of seeing.
Yep, it is normal to see those ups and downs, especially in water bodies that are relatively close to that standard to begin with. But it's definitely, that's why we collect the data, so we can see over time if it's changing.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions, commissioners? All right. Well, there is no action required on that. That was just an update for this year. And we will move into our annual deer management program report again. Welcome, Caleb, on. Tell us about the deer. How are they doing?
All right. Just a second here. All right, so yeah, I'm here to do our annual deer management report. For anyone who's just turning in, I'm Caleb Ashling, the Natural Resources Specialist. And yeah, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview here of our program history. The Natural Resources Master Plan, which was passed by City Council in 1999, recommended that the city establish a deer management program. That initiated the deer management plan being developed, and that was adopted by City Council in 2001. And among the things that plan did was it set the population density goal for deer in the city. This program was established for several reasons. Some of the most important ones were to try to reduce the impacts of deer and vehicle collisions, which obviously is bad for all involved, but it can cause injuries for people and expense for vehicle repairs. High deer populations can also result in negative impacts to natural areas. So deer can really overbrowse the native vegetation in our natural areas and have a negative impact on the plants themselves and also other pollinators that may, and other animals that need those plants as well. So that can be an issue. Deer can also create landscaping depredation for people who live, especially in and around some of our park areas. And then a higher deer population is at a greater risk for disease spreading, so that's another reason to conduct deer management. So I'm going to be reporting on our past program year, and then also making some recommendations for our upcoming program year. And each program year runs from April 1st of the previous year to March 31st, so it doesn't run the calendar year, it runs a little bit offset just due to some of the activities, overwinter activities that are conducted. So for going over the program here, I'm going to cover a couple different aspects of it: the education side of things, the feeding ban, monitoring of the deer population, and then also population control. So for education, we have a web page with educational information for the public. We have a link to our plan and also updates on the management activities that are conducted. We do also try to post articles in the Burnsville Bulletin, especially related to the city's deer feeding ban. Try to get that information out there, as well as using social media to relay information about deer. And then for the feeding ban, so there is a no deer feeding ordinance in Burnsville. That means that you can have bird feeders, but bird feeders have to be at least 5 feet above the ground or otherwise screened to prevent deer from feeding on it. So putting food on the ground, whether it's intentional or not, if deer can access it, that's against ordinance.
What happens when the birds put the feet on the ground?
Yes, we will not. The birds will not be in violation, I guess. But if people are making a good faith effort to keep food off the ground, that's the main thing. There were no feeding violations this past year, which was great. Usually we have at least a couple. But when we do have those feeding violations, what we do is we send a letter and give them some time to remove it, and then double check to make sure the feeding situation has been changed. And that's almost always enough to stop the issue. Then on to monitoring. So we monitor in 2 different ways. We have an aerial count conducted to count the population, and then we also monitor vehicle collisions with deer. So for monitoring and our deer program in general, we break the city into 6 different zones: northeast, northwest, west central, east central, southwest, and southeast. So that's how I'll be kind of referring to some aspects of the program in the next part of the presentation. And then we try to have an aerial survey conducted every year. This past program year, the survey was conducted on February 7th. And this is an aerial survey conducted by helicopter. And the Three Rivers Park District conducts that for us. They also fly Murphy-Hanrahan Park. They often fly for the city of Bloomington, sometimes for Fort Snelling State Park. So they're covering a number of areas in the South Metro, so it works out well for us to work with them. And they're basically flying over these areas when there's at least 6 inches of snow cover, so the deer are fairly easy to see. And this picture here is a picture from a helicopter, so you can kind of see how the deer stand out pretty well from the air. So for our most recent survey, the total deer population that was counted was actually 106. It says 104 on the right side here because we're factoring in some deer that were removed after the survey. But in general, the biggest population or biggest herd when the survey was conducted was in the northeast part of town, which often is one of the bigger areas because it's where the wildlife refuge is and there's a lot of habitat down there. The next biggest was in the southwest part of town around Murphy-Hanrahan. That usually is the second biggest population because there's lots of habitat in that area as well. And then following that was the east central with 26 deer counted. That is a fairly high count for that area where there is Terrace Oaks and some other relatively big parks, but not as many big natural areas as some of those other parts of town. And then for tracking deer vehicle collisions, this is a map here that shows where those deer vehicle collisions occurred. The way we track that is by having our police department pull the records that are associated with any deer related issues. Then the city also works with an animal control contractor where they pick up deer carcasses along the roadway and they keep notes on where they pick those up. So we cross-reference between our police reports and animal control contractor pickups and basically get a minimum number of collisions that happened. We know not every collision is reported. But in general, we had a total of 53 based on those records, which is a bit above what we've had in the last couple years. It's been closer to 40, but below some of the higher years before the program was started. That was more like 70 and 80. The highest number of collisions happened in the southeast part of town this year, followed by the southwest part of town, and then the east central area. Numerous ones around Terrace Oaks was kind of the third most there with 11. And then our recommendation is to continue with these annual monitoring methods that we've been using. And then on to the population control part of the program. So we use 2 strategies for population control. We use archery hunting and then also sharpshooting conducted by the Burnsville Police Department. For our archery program, we encourage archery hunting on private property. There's, in general, not a ton of private properties where that can happen in Burnsville. But there are some, especially in southwest Burnsville, where the lots are large enough where you can actually do archery hunting within what's allowed by city ordinance. So there is some private property archery hunting. And then we also operate archery hunts on public land where it's possible. Right now, Kelleher Park is the park where we do that. And then for that archery hunt, there were 5 deer harvested in Kelleher Park last fall over 2 hunt sessions. And there, at the same time as the city hunt, there's also a hunt conducted by the Three Rivers Park District and Murphy-Hanrahan Park. There were 38 deer harvested in that hunt. About 10% of Murphy-Hanrahan Park is in Burnsville. For the purposes of our program tracking, we consider about 4 of those deer to be removed from Burnsville. And then for our sharpshooting program, we utilize our Burnsville Police Department sharpshooters to do deer removals when needed. Last year we conducted sharpshooting in the northeast, east central, and southeast units over this past winter. And through that effort there were 17 deer harvested. And so just looking at our removal goals and actual harvest for the past program year, and the removal goals are based on the population estimate and their overall goal for that area, 15 to 25 deer per square mile of habitat. In the northwest part of town, which is kind of where the Kramer Mining Quarry is and the landfill, we don't have any accessible property, so we didn't do any deer management in that area. In West Central, we didn't do any deer management. In the southwest part of town, there were 9 deer removed through archery hunting. In the northeast part of town, there were 10 deer harvested. That's the area near the wildlife refuge. In the east central part of town, we weren't as successful as we would have liked, only 1 deer in that area. And in the southeast part of town, 6 deer. So between archery hunting and our sharpshooting, there were 26 deer removed. We would have liked to have removed some additional deer. It was a challenging winter with really high snow depth that changed some of the deer patterns where they just weren't coming into some of our sharpshooting sites like they may other years. And it's a lot easier for them to move around. But in general, we were able to get some deer reduced from the population this winter.
What would have been the target?
35 or so would have been a good goal for us to achieve. For 35, or including archery, maybe 40. And then for this upcoming year, so as I mentioned, we have a density goal based on the habitat within each zone. So that's kind of the target for each section of town there on the left side of this table. In the middle, we have a projected population. That's basically the survey information that we collected. And then we have a population model similar to what the DNR does that we factor in some fawn birth, some natural mortality. That gives us what we expect the population to be in the fall. And that should actually say projected fall 2023 population. And then that gives us our recommended population removal goals according to our plan for this upcoming winter. So again, in northwest part of town, the city doesn't have access to any areas to sharpshoot, so we won't be doing work there. In the west central part of town, there were no deer counted, so no removals warranted there. Southwest Burnsville, the goal for that area is 0 to 13 deer, and that's the area where we do archery, which we'll continue with. We're proposing to continue with that archery hunting in those areas. Northeast part of town, the goal is 1 to 22 deer. In the east central part of town, where there's a little less habitat, as I mentioned, there's removal goal of 15 to 23 deer. And in the southeast, where we didn't count any deer, the goal there is 0. And then the total potential harvest range recommended by the plan is 16 to 58 deer.
Just get the ones that are eating my wife's plants.
And then our recommendations for sharpshooting based on that is to conduct sharpshooting in the northeast part of Burnsville. That's wildlife refuge part of town in general. And then the east central part of Burnsville as well. And then again, the archery in southwest Burnsville. Sharpshooting locations will be determined, so we'll identify the zones, but then we'll identify the specific actual sites within that part of town based on deer activity. And then for archery hunt recommendations, we recommend continuing with the Kellerhare Park archery hunt in the southwest unit. Last year, we switched from that being facilitated directly by the city to having that facilitated by the Three Rivers Park District, with the city also participating. And then the actual hunt, coordinating the actual hunters on the ground, is conducted by a nonprofit organization called the Metro Bow Hunters Resource Base. They specialize in conducting public archery hunts in suburban environments, basically. And we've been working with them for a long time. And then it is part of our program that PNRC review the proposed archery hunt dates. and potentially recommend them for approval by City Council. So the dates for hunting at Kelleher Park as well as Murphy-Hanrahan Park this upcoming fall, those proposed dates are October 13th through the 15th. That's Friday through Sunday, and November 10th through the 12th, another Friday through the Sunday. So those are our proposed dates for this year. And then with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
So when a hunt is gonna take place, I know in Bloomington, because I walk the river, they'll have signage like, you know, that they're doing their hunt on the Bloomington side. Do we do the same thing where we post like, you may not want to walk today?
Yes, yep, we do public notifications for archery and sharpshooting, so notification letters to adjacent homeowners and press releases to the public. And then we definitely also have signage on actual hunt days on all of the main trail access points to those park areas.
Follow-up, overall deer population in Burnsville, steady, increasing, decreasing?
Yeah, it can depend on the part of town, I guess, but in general, the overall population has been decreasing over the past few years.
Is it migration or just management or combination?
I would say a combination. So management is definitely part of it. Deer also move around. So we're surveying Burnsville, but they don't necessarily care about the city lines. So they're moving in and out of town at times. So that can impact the population. Other factors, like we've had a couple of deep snow winters, which can be hard on deer, can also impact the population as well. So there's multiple factors, but management is definitely part of it.
So question for you. When they surveyed the southeast part of Burnsville, where did they look?
Yeah, so our deer management plan identified preferred deer habitat areas. So those are basically the natural areas, or private property if it has significant natural component to it. So they're not surveying every street or every backyard in town. That just wouldn't really be feasible. We're really focusing on the areas where the deer are most likely to hang out. So there may be a few deer missed here and there, but it does give us a good baseline knowledge of, you know, at least this many deer are present where we can make management decisions off of that. With that.
I'll send you my neighborhood information. There are 7 living in my neighborhood right now that we have counted. And they're eating all the plants. And they like my backyard a lot. I was
Good to hop my fence.
Yes. I almost hit a whole family of 5 one evening a couple weeks ago.
And that's good information, and we do have a reporting form online where people can submit reports and observations of deer, and then we can use that because, you know, that information from the public can help us gauge if there are areas where we may want to do some additional surveying. So we do have that monitoring form for the public where you can submit that information or send it to me directly.
Perfect. Because I do have someone in my neighborhood who's been using a shotgun. So,
We did mention the police are involved in the program, right? So.
right? Can use some attention in my neighborhood, I think. Oh my gosh. So speaking of that, what is the ordinance for archery in your backyard?
Yeah, so you have to be able to set up to be able to discharge your bow at least 200 feet from the property boundary. 200 feet? Yeah, so you have to be able to be at least 200 feet from the property boundary. That means your typical quarter acre or even half acre lot, you're not going to be able to find a spot like that. But if you have maybe an acre or a little bit more land, you could potentially find a spot where you can set up your stand far enough from your property boundary to be able to archery hunt. And we do know, we get questions of some folks on the public who do archery hunt in Burnsville, so there is some of that going on.
Perfect. Any other questions, commissioners?
I was debating whether or not if it was a silly question, but just going back to the whole no feeding ban. Like I see kids all the time running around the neighborhood setting up like little feeding type stands, and one of my neighbors, I won't call them out, you know, all of a sudden there's all these ducks that keep showing up at their house, and I drove by one day and realized there's all this stuff in their yard, and now all the ducks are landing on top of their house or all over the neighborhood.
At least they're not geese.
Yet. And I mean, you said there was like no feeding violations. I mean, is this just community reported?
Yeah, so it is community reported. There is, in addition to the deer feeding ban, there is also a waterfowl, duck and goose feeding ban. So it is also against ordinance to feed those. And in general, a lot of people, I'm a natural resources person. I enjoy feeding wildlife. Most of the people aren't out there to do something that's bad. They just enjoy seeing wildlife, but they aren't always aware that that can impact their neighbors. Sometimes there's environmental issues. If you're attracting a lot of ducks and there's all the duck poop that goes along with it, if you're near a pond, it all washes into the pond. So there's a number of factors that people don't always realize. So we do kind of rely, we're not out there driving around looking for this, but we rely on the public to let us know, and we always try to interact kindly with people to just educate them on the issue.
All right, any other questions? All right. Clarification question, did you need a vote for us to approve the recommendation tonight?
Yeah, we need a vote to recommend city council approval of the archery hunt dates at Kelleher and Murphy-Hanrahan Park.
So recommend.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Your motion passes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Our next Parks and Recreation Commission meeting will be June 5th, 2023. Commissioner training is scheduled for June 14th of this year as well. At this time, I would like to request a motion for adjournment of the May 1st, 2023 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting.
So move.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody want to stay here longer? All right. Have a good evening, everybody, and we will see you in June. Have a great month off. Oh, wait, I guess it's not a month off.